I can trace the beginning of this strange ordeal to a specific day, one that, in retrospect, should have been unremarkable. It was 1999, and like many people at the time, I was still clinging to analog technology while the world around me shifted into digital. My name is Michael Adams, and I work in estate clearance, a job that requires the slow, methodical sorting of people's possessions after they've passed, often before their families come to collect what's left. It sounds grim, I know, but I've always found something satisfying in cataloging the remnants of a life. People leave behind strange things. I've found love letters tucked into forgotten books, rare coins scattered in sock drawers, and unfinished manuscripts that were never meant to see the light of day. But nothing could have prepared me for the Betamax tape. I'd been working a job for the estate of a man named Daniel Hawthorne. His home, a small, neglected Victorian just outside of town, had sat empty for almost a year after his death. Hawthorne had no immediate family, at least none that I'd been told of, so the house was being cleared to prepare for sale. It was a typical job. Nothing about the man or his possessions seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until I found the tape. I came across it while sorting through a musty box of old VHS and Betamax tapes in Hawthorne's attic. The attic itself was a strange place, filled with relics from the past that hadn't seen daylight in years. I'd always loved that about my job, getting to unearth the little treasures people forgot they owned. But this attic felt different, oppressive even. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden beams overhead groaned like they were tired of holding up the weight of time. The Betamax tape was buried at the bottom of the box, unlabeled except for one word scrawled across it in shaky handwriting: confession. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Old tapes like this weren't all that unusual. Betamax had its moment in the 80s before VHS took over, but something about this one seemed off. Maybe it was the lack of any other markings, or maybe it was the sense of finality in the word confession. I tossed it into my work bag, thinking nothing more of it at the time. That night, when I got home, I found myself pulling the tape out again. I hadn't used my Betamax player in years, but I still had one tucked away in a cabinet, a relic from my past. I'd always been something of a collector of obsolete technology, so it wasn't uncommon for me to find the odd Betamax tape or two when clearing an estate. Normally, I wouldn't bother watching them, but there was something about this one that intrigued me. I popped it into the player, the machine groaning to life with a mechanical whir that felt both nostalgic and unfamiliar. The screen flickered, then cleared to reveal a man sitting in a dimly lit room. He was older, maybe in his late 60s or early 70s, with thinning gray hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to carry a weight of regret. I recognized him instantly. It was Daniel Hawthorne, the man whose house I'd been clearing that very day. "Whoever's watching this," he began, his voice raspy and uneven, "I'm already gone, and there's something you need to know." I leaned in, my eyes glued to the screen as he paused, taking a breath that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life. This was the confession, I realized, the one I hadn't been sure I wanted to hear. "There are things I've done," Hawthorne continued, his gaze shifting away from the camera for a moment, as though what he was about to say was too much to face directly. "Things I regret, and things I can't take back. But what I'm about to tell you, you must understand. This isn't just about me." There was a tremble in his voice now, a fear that crept into the edges of his words. My stomach tightened as I wondered what could cause a man like him, someone who'd lived a quiet, solitary life, at least as far as I could tell, to be so afraid in his final moments. "I made a mistake," he said, his eyes snapping back to the camera, locking onto mine as if he could see me watching him. And it cost more than just my soul. There's a reason I've lived alone all these years. A reason I never married, never had children. I've been protecting people, protecting them from something I unleashed. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't the confession of a petty crime, or some old man's guilt over an affair. This was something deeper, something darker. Hawthorne glanced over his shoulder, as though he were checking to make sure no one was watching him. His hands trembled as he rubbed them together, his fingers twitching nervously. If you're seeing this, it's already too late. You need to understand. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I didn't mean for them to die. The screen flickered for a moment, the sound warping slightly as Hawthorne's voice dropped into a whisper. I leaned closer, straining to hear his words. It started with an accident. Or at least I thought it was an accident. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized none of it was a coincidence. The deaths, the disappearances, they were all connected, and I was at the center of it. He paused again, his face contorting in pain as though the memories were physically hurting him. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could stop it. But every time I tried, it just got worse. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to process what I was hearing. Hawthorne wasn't just confessing to a crime. He was confessing to something much larger, something that seemed impossible. What could he have done that had such far-reaching consequences? There's more, he said, his voice dropping even lower, barely above a murmur. But I can't say it. Not here. If you want to know the truth, you'll have to find it yourself. But be warned, you may not like what you discover. And with that, the screen went black. I sat there in silence, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. Who was Hawthorne, really? And what had he been so afraid of? As I stared at the blank screen, a gnawing sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tape had been too vague, too cryptic, and yet the fear in Hawthorne's eyes had been unmistakable. It wasn't just the typical remorse of an old man recounting his life's mistakes. It felt like a warning, one I didn't fully understand yet. I went back to Hawthorne's house, ostensibly to finish the job, but really because I needed answers. The attic was still as I'd left it, the dusty air hanging heavy in the room. I went through the rest of the boxes, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen on the tape. There were old papers, photo albums, and more videotapes, but none of them seemed to offer any clues. That's when I realized I needed help. I wasn't a detective or an investigator. I cleared out dead people's homes for a living. But I knew someone who might be able to help. My friend Jake was an archivist at the local library. If anyone could help me dig into Daniel Hawthorne's past, it was him. I gave Jake a call, and we met up later that afternoon at the library. He was a lanky guy, perpetually dressed in wrinkled shirts and worn jeans, with a pair of glasses that always seemed to be perched precariously on the edge of his nose. He loved old records and ancient newspapers, and the library's archives were his domain. "So, what's this about?" Jake asked, sitting across from me at a small table in the library's dimly lit back room. The smell of old books permeated the air, mingling with the scent of wood polish and dust. "I need to know more about a guy named Daniel Hawthorne," I said, placing a small stack of papers in front of him. "He died last year, and I'm clearing out his house. I found something strange." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Hawthorne, you say? I'll see what I can find. He got up and disappeared into the maze of shelves, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I hadn't told him about the tape yet. Not because I didn't trust him. I just didn't know how to explain it. The confession had been too surreal, too vague to simply relay over coffee and expect someone to understand. Besides, I wasn't sure I fully understood it myself. Was it possible that Hawthorne had simply been losing his mind in his final days? Or had he really been involved in something darker, something that had spiraled out of his control? Jake returned a short while later with a thick folder of old newspaper clippings and files. Here's what we've got on Daniel Hawthorne, he said, setting the folder down in front of me. He was a quiet guy, lived alone, no real family to speak of. Owned a small hardware store downtown in the 70s and 80s. But here's where it gets interesting. He flipped open the folder to a section of yellowed clippings. There were a series of mysterious deaths in the late 80s, all connected to Hawthorne in one way or another. They were written off as accidents at the time, but there's definitely a pattern. My pulse quickened as I scanned the articles. A car accident in 1984, a house fire in 1986, a drowning in 1988. In each case, the victims had either worked for Hawthorne or had some sort of business dealings with him. But there was never any clear connection beyond that. No foul play was suspected, and each death had been ruled an unfortunate accident. Hawthorne was questioned a couple of times, Jake continued, but nothing ever came of it. No charges, no real suspicion. He was just an unlucky guy who happened to be connected to a string of bad luck. But 3 deaths in 4 years? I said, shaking my head. That's more than bad luck. Yeah, Jake agreed, especially when you consider what happened next. I looked up at him, a knot forming in my stomach. What happened next? Jake flipped to another article, this one dated 1990. The headline read, "Hardware store owner found dead in apparent suicide." Hawthorne tried to kill himself in 1990, Jake explained. He survived, but after that, he sold the store and basically became a recluse. No one saw much of him after that. He kept to himself, never remarried, never had any kids. Lived in that old house until he died last year. I stared at the article, feeling the weight of the words sinking in. So Hawthorne had been connected to a string of mysterious deaths, and then he'd tried to kill himself. Why? What had driven him to such desperation? I thought back to the tape, to the way Hawthorne had spoken about his mistakes, about the deaths and disappearances. He hadn't just been feeling guilty. He had been terrified. There's something else, Jake said, pulling out one last article. It was an obituary, dated a few months after Hawthorne's suicide attempt. The name on the obituary sent a chill down my spine. Clara Hawthorne. His wife, Jake said softly. She disappeared in 1989, right before Hawthorne's suicide attempt. Her body was never found, and the case remains unsolved to this day. I felt my throat tighten. This was starting to make sense, in a way that made my skin crawl. Hawthorne's life had been filled with tragedy, yes, but it wasn't random. His wife had disappeared, and then he had been linked to a series of deaths. And now, in the last moments of his life, he'd left behind a cryptic confession about something he couldn't control. What do you think? Jake asked, watching me carefully. You think he was guilty of something? I didn't know how to answer that. Maybe he had been guilty, but not in the way anyone had suspected. Maybe Hawthorne had been at the center of something far bigger than just a series of accidents, something that had driven him to the brink of madness. I think, I said slowly, "that there's more to this story than we realize." Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You want to go deeper?" I nodded. "I have to." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the tape, about Hawthorne's warning, about the things he'd done that he couldn't take back. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something dark and unknown, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't walk away now, not without knowing the truth. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a part of me wondered if I was making a mistake. If maybe, just maybe, Hawthorne had been right. Some truths weren't meant to be uncovered. And yet, I knew I couldn't stop now. Whatever Hawthorne had unleashed, whatever he had been hiding, I was going to find out, no matter what it cost me. Sleep was fleeting that night, replaced by a growing sense of urgency that clung to me like a heavy fog. Hawthorne's voice echoed in my head, repeating the same cryptic phrases. I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought I could fix it. They were all connected. But connected to what? And more importantly, how? I woke early, feeling an overwhelming need to return to the house. The air was cooler that morning, and the overcast sky cast a dull, oppressive light over everything. As I approached Hawthorne's old Victorian house, a sense of unease tightened around my chest. I had to remind myself that I'd been in hundreds of homes like this, houses filled with forgotten memories, places left behind by the passage of time. And yet, this one felt different. I entered through the side door, as I had the previous day, the floorboards creaking underfoot as I made my way to the attic. It was still as dusty and cluttered as before, but today, it felt like the attic was watching me. I had already gone through the boxes, but I was certain there was something I had missed, something that would give context to the Betamax tape and Hawthorne's confession. I spent hours sifting through old papers and boxes, carefully examining every scrap of paper, every note and photograph. Hawthorne had lived a mostly uneventful life on the surface, but there were little details that began to stick out, odd things that painted a different picture. I found a photo album that dated back to the early 80s, and flipping through the pages, I saw images of Hawthorne and his wife, Clara. In the earlier photos, they looked happy, smiling together at what appeared to be various vacation spots and family gatherings. But the further I flipped, the more the smiles faded. Clara began to appear distant in the photographs, her eyes hollow, as if she were merely going through the motions of life. And then, in the later pages, she was gone entirely. The photos became exclusively of Hawthorne, alone in various places around town, with a sadness that seemed to seep through the ink. There were no captions, no dates, no explanations. I also found a series of journals. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing Hawthorne's daily life, the goings-on at his hardware store, his quiet evenings spent reading or watching television. But as I read deeper into the journals, starting around 1988, the entries began to change. December 10th, 1988. I can't shake this feeling. Clara's been distant, more than usual. She won't talk to me about it. She says she's fine, but I know something's wrong. She hasn't been sleeping, and when she does, she wakes up screaming. It's like she's seen something terrible, but she won't tell me what. February 3rd, 1989. I found her standing in the yard last night staring up at the sky. It was freezing, but she didn't seem to notice. She was whispering something to herself, but when I called her name, she didn't respond. When I finally got her to come back inside, she wouldn't talk to me. I don't know what's happening to her. I'm scared. May 15th, 1989. I don't know what to do. Clara she's not herself anymore. She keeps talking about them, but she won't say who they are. She says they've been watching her, following her. She's paranoid all the time, locking the doors and windows, checking the closets. I thought it was just stress, but it's getting worse. June 30th, 1989. She's gone. Clara's gone, and I don't know where. The police say she ran away, but I don't believe it. She wouldn't just leave like that. She's been talking about strange things for months now, saying that something was coming for her. I don't know what to believe anymore. I stared at the final entry, the weight of it pressing down on me. Clara had vanished in 1989, but it was clear that something had been happening long before that. Something that had broken her. The journals painted a picture of a man watching his wife slip away into madness. But there was an undercurrent of something darker, an influence neither of them could understand. I sat back, the pieces starting to form a terrible picture in my mind. Hawthorne's cryptic confession, his wife's disappearance, the string of deaths. It was all connected, just as he'd said. But what had Clara seen? Who were they? And why did Hawthorne believe he was responsible for everything that had happened? Suddenly, the stillness of the house was shattered by the sound of footsteps on the floor below. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I was supposed to be alone. No one else had been given permission to enter the house. I quietly stepped away from the journals, creeping toward the attic stairs. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was carefully moving through the rooms downstairs. I strained to listen, trying to make out any voices, but there was only silence beyond the footsteps. Whoever it was, they weren't talking. I moved cautiously down the stairs, careful to avoid making any noise. The house was old, and the floorboards had a tendency to creak at the slightest pressure, but I managed to descend without drawing attention to myself. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the front door was open, swaying gently as though someone had just passed through. But there was no one in sight. I moved to the door and looked outside, scanning the overgrown yard and the empty street beyond. There was no sign of anyone. I shut the door, locking it behind me as a chill crept down my spine. Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone curious about the house, but somehow, I doubted that. The way those footsteps had sounded, the deliberate pace, they hadn't been the movements of a curious passerby. I returned to the attic, my mind racing. The more I dug into Hawthorne's past, the more it felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me at every turn. It was irrational, I knew, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. I glanced at my phone. Jake had been right. Hawthorne's life was far more complicated than it had appeared. The deaths, Clara's disappearance, his failed suicide, all of it was building toward something. But what? I picked up the Betamax tape again, staring at it as if it held all the answers. I had watched Hawthorne's confession once, but there had been something about the way he'd spoken. Something I couldn't place. Maybe if I watched it again, I'd pick up on something I'd missed. I pulled the tape from my bag and held it in my hands for a moment, weighing my options. There was no Betamax player here in Hawthorne's attic, but I couldn't leave. I needed to know more. I went downstairs, moving through the dusty rooms of the house until I found what I was looking for. In the corner of an old living room, tucked beneath a heap of clutter, was a vintage Betamax player still hooked up to a small TV. The screen was smeared with dust, the machine itself a relic of the 1980s. It was as if no one had touched it in years. I sat down in the nearest chair, wiped the dust from the screen, and inserted the tape. My hands trembled slightly as I hit play. The screen flickered to life, and there he was again, Daniel Hawthorne, staring into the camera with that same look of dread. I listened carefully this time, my eyes narrowing as I watched his every movement. His voice was steady at first, but as the confession went on, he began to falter, his words becoming more strained, more desperate. "There's more," he said, his eyes widening as he glanced over his shoulder. "But I can't say it. Not here." I leaned forward, holding my breath. "If you want to know the truth, you'll have to find it yourself." And then, just before the screen went black, I noticed it. A flash of something in the corner of the frame. It was brief, barely a second, but it was there. I rewound the tape and watched again. There, in the corner of the frame, I saw what looked like the edge of a door. Not the door to the room Hawthorne was in, but another door behind him. A door that was slightly open. It wasn't just Hawthorne in that room. Someone, or something, had been there with him. That brief flash on the screen, that barely visible door ajar behind Hawthorne, sent my thoughts spinning. My initial instinct was to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, or maybe just an overlooked part of the room. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Hawthorne had been terrified in that recording, haunted by something unseen. And now I had confirmation that he wasn't alone in the room, at least not in the way I had initially believed. I replayed the last few seconds of the tape over and over, hoping for more clarity. But the door was only visible for a fraction of a second before the screen cut to black. Whoever, or whatever, was behind that door remained hidden. It was unsettling, to say the least. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me from my fixation on the tape. It was Jake. I answered quickly. "Hey, I've been thinking about your guy, Hawthorne," Jake said, his voice calm but curious. "There's something I didn't mention yesterday." "Yeah?" I replied, pacing around the attic, my mind still spinning with possibilities. "Well, I did some more digging last night," he continued. "It turns out there's an unsolved case that might be linked to him, another disappearance that happened in 1990. A woman named Margaret Lane went missing around the same time Hawthorne attempted suicide." That stopped me in my tracks. Another disappearance? Yeah, it didn't get much attention at the time. Margaret worked at a hardware store, and she was last seen the night before Hawthorne tried to take his life. The police questioned him, but nothing came of it. She was just gone. It got written off as another cold case. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. Margaret's disappearance and Hawthorne's suicide attempt. They couldn't be a coincidence. Another life tied to Hawthorne's web of tragedies. "Why didn't they suspect him?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Hawthorne's quiet demeanor and lack of a criminal record had probably been enough to keep suspicion at bay. "There wasn't enough evidence," Jake replied. "No witnesses, no signs of foul play. It was like she just vanished." That word again. Vanished. First Clara, now Margaret. Two women connected to Hawthorne had disappeared without a trace. And there was that door on the tape, that brief glimpse of something hidden behind him. My mind raced with questions, but none of the answers seemed to make sense. "Thanks, Jake," I said, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. "I'll see if I can find anything more." I hung up and sat back down, staring at the screen. I knew I was missing something that tied all of this together. Hawthorne's cryptic confession, Clara's disappearance, the accidents, the unsolved deaths, and now Margaret Lane's vanishing. There was a pattern here, but it was buried deep beneath layers of fear and secrecy. I headed back toward the attic, but something made me pause at the base of the stairs. For a brief moment, I stood there and thought for a second. If Hawthorne had been keeping secrets, There had to be something here. I walked slowly through each room, studying the layout, the furniture, the decorations. The house was old, lived in but not cared for. There were little signs of life everywhere, forgotten coffee cups, dust-covered trinkets, faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, but nothing that screamed clue or answer. It wasn't until I reached the basement that I began to feel a change in the atmosphere. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, much like the door in the tape, and I hesitated for a moment before pulling it open fully. The air that rose up from the dark stairs was musty, colder than the rest of the house, and it carried a faint metallic scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a deep breath and descended. The basement was mostly unfinished, with cement floors and exposed brick walls. It was darker down here, the windows covered with thick dust and grime, allowing only slivers of light to break through. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with old tools, broken appliances, and boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I walked slowly through the space, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light, feeling a growing sense of unease. At first, it seemed like just another part of the house, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I made my way toward the far corner of the basement, I noticed something odd. A small door, barely taller than 3 feet, built into the brick wall. It was so low to the ground and narrow that it would be easy to miss, tucked away in the shadows. My heart began to race. This was the kind of thing you saw in nightmares, the kind of door that led to dark, secret places best left alone. But if I'd learned anything over the past few days, it was that I couldn't afford to leave anything unchecked. I crouched down, gripping the small rusted handle, and slowly pulled the door open. It groaned in protest, and a gust of stale air hit me, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. Beyond the door was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, leading deeper underground. A cold sweat prickled at my skin as I stared into the dark. This was it. Whatever Hawthorne had been hiding, whatever he had been afraid of, it had to be down there. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and clicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the thick blackness of the passage. I hesitated only for a moment before ducking down and crawling inside. The passage was cramped and tight, the walls made of rough stone that scraped against my shoulders as I inched forward. It felt like I was descending deeper into the earth, the air growing colder and more oppressive with every foot I crawled. The flashlight's beam flickered slightly, casting shadows that made the passage seem even more claustrophobic. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a small underground room. I climbed out of the narrow tunnel and stood, my legs trembling as I took in my surroundings. The room was dark and empty, the walls lined with old stone, and the floor covered in dirt and dust. But there was something else. A smell, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air. The metallic scent I had noticed earlier was stronger here. It was the smell of blood. My stomach churned as I scanned the room, my flashlight illuminating a small, crudely built altar at the far end. There were dark stains on the stone, dried and crusted, the evidence of something horrific that had taken place here long ago. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just an ordinary basement. This was a place of ritual, a place where something terrible had been done, something that connected to Hawthorne, to Clara, to the women who had vanished. I moved closer to the altar, feeling my heart pound in my chest. There were objects scattered around it, small trinkets, locks of hair, and a torn photograph. I picked up the photograph with trembling fingers, the edges yellowed and worn. It was a picture of Hawthorne and Clara, standing in front of their house, smiling like everything in their world was perfect. But their world had never been perfect. It had been cursed, tainted by whatever Hawthorne had unleashed. Suddenly, I felt it, a presence in the room with me. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen, but undeniably there. And then, from the darkness behind me, came the faintest whisper of breath. I froze, the faint breath behind me sending a cold, prickling sensation down my spine. For a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing, and the oppressive silence of the underground room seemed to press in on me from all sides. Slowly, I turned, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I swept it across the room, searching for the source of that sound. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. But the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, like something unseen was lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This place, this hidden chamber beneath Hawthorne's house, it wasn't just a relic of his past. It was something darker, something tied to all the strange events surrounding his life. The altar, the bloodstains, the trinkets, they were evidence of something sinister, something that had taken root in this house long ago. I turned my attention back to the altar, stepping closer, my heart racing. I could feel that whatever had happened here, it wasn't just about Clara or Margaret or the other victims. It was about Hawthorne himself, his cryptic confession, his desperate attempt to explain the events that had ruined his life. It all led back to this room. As I knelt in front of the altar, I noticed something strange. A small, leather-bound book tucked beneath a pile of dusty objects. It was worn, its cover cracked and faded with age. With trembling hands, I reached for it, pulling it free from the debris. The moment I touched it, a chill ran through me, and I instinctively knew that this book held the answers I'd been searching for. I opened it, my flashlight illuminating the brittle pages. It wasn't a journal, not exactly. It was more like a record of events. Scrawled in Hawthorne's familiar handwriting were dates and names, all written in hurried, frantic script. The entries were short, almost cryptic, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. January 12th, 1989. Clara's dreams are getting worse. She says they're trying to communicate with her, but I can't make sense of it. I've tried everything, but the more I look into it, the more I'm convinced this isn't just in her head. Something is here, in this house, watching us. March 3rd, 1989. I found her in the basement again. She doesn't remember going down there, but I'm starting to think it isn't her choice. She keeps talking about a presence, something that wants her to follow. I don't know how to stop it. June 17th, 1989. They're here. I can feel them now too. I don't know how I didn't see it before, but they've been here all along. Clara's right. This isn't something we can fight. They want something from us. From her. I don't know if I can protect her anymore. August 5th, 1989. Clara's gone. I did everything I could, but it wasn't enough. I thought I could stop them, but they took her. I don't know where, but I know it's because of me. I've unleashed something I didn't understand. October 10th, 1989. Margaret's missing now. It's happening again. The same thing that happened to Clara. I don't know how to make it stop. I can't let it happen to anyone else, but I don't know how to control them. They're getting stronger. Every day, they're stronger. The entries continued, but I had to stop reading, my mind reeling from the implications. Hawthorne hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. He had somehow summoned or drawn these entities to him. He hadn't meant to, but his actions had opened a door to something dark and powerful, something that had taken Clara, Margaret, and who knows how many others. The book slipped from my hands, landing softly in the dust as I tried to make sense of it all. Hawthorne had spent years trying to fight them, to protect the people around him from the thing he had unleashed. But he had failed. His wife was gone, his life ruined, and the deaths and disappearances continued to pile up. As I sat there in the silence of the underground room, it occurred to me that the presence I had felt, the whisper of breath, the sensation of being watched, it wasn't just paranoia. They were here. Hawthorne had invited them into his life, and now they were watching me too. I stood quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of this place. Whatever had happened here, whatever Hawthorne had done, it wasn't safe for me to stay any longer. I turned toward the small passage that had led me into the room, but as I did, I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure in the air. It was as though the very atmosphere had thickened, growing heavier with each passing second. The flashlight flickered, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Then, from the darkness at the far end of the room, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. My chest tightened with fear, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The flashlight flickered again, and I caught a glimpse of something, a shape, moving in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, distorted limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved toward me. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The shape came closer, its features indistinct but menacing, and I realized with a sickening certainty that this was what Hawthorne had been running from. This was what had taken Clara and Margaret. With a burst of adrenaline, I finally forced my legs to move, scrambling toward the small passage. I crawled through the narrow tunnel, my heart racing as I tried to escape the thing behind me. I could feel it in the darkness, its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I made it out of the tunnel and into the basement, gasping for air as I slammed the small door shut behind me. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back as I ran for the front door. I burst out of the house, my lungs burning as I stumbled onto the front lawn, collapsing to my knees. The oppressive weight of the basement was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever Hawthorne had unleashed was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I had seen only a glimpse of it, but that was enough to know that this wasn't something I could fight. It wasn't something I could understand. I sat there in the cold, damp grass, my mind spinning. Hawthorne had spent years trying to fix his mistake, but in the end, it had consumed him. It had taken everyone he cared about, and now I was caught in the same web. As I looked up at the old, crumbling Victorian house, I realized the truth. Hawthorne had left me that tape for a reason. He hadn't been trying to confess his sins. He had been trying to warn me. He had been trying to pass the burden on to someone else. And now, it was mine. I didn't return to Hawthorne's house for days. I told myself it was because I needed time to process everything I had learned, but the truth was simpler. I was scared. That thing I had seen in the basement, the presence I had felt closing in on me, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had come face to face with something that wasn't just a ghost or a hallucination. It was real, and it was waiting. I tried to convince myself that I could just walk away, that I could leave the house, the tape, and Hawthorne's mess behind. But the more I tried to forget, the harder it became to ignore the gnawing sense of responsibility growing inside me. Hawthorne had tried to warn me, tried to pass this burden along, and now I had to decide what to do with it. It wasn't just about me anymore. The more I researched, the more I realized how deep this thing went. I found old police records and interviews with people who had known Hawthorne before his wife disappeared, and all of them mentioned the same thing. He had been a normal man. He'd lived an ordinary life until something changed. Something had happened to him and Clara. But no one knew exactly what. There was no clear event, no tragic accident or traumatic loss. Just a gradual unraveling of their lives, until Clara disappeared and Hawthorne spiraled into madness. And then there were the disappearances. People linked to Hawthorne or his hardware store, all vanishing without a trace. All connected, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. The more I dug, the more I began to wonder if I was already too deep. The nightmares started a few nights after my visit to the basement. I would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own home. In the dreams, I would see Clara standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips moving but no sound coming out. And behind her, always in the shadows, the shape, the thing from the basement, watching me. I couldn't escape it. It was like the darkness from Hawthorne's life was creeping into mine, spreading into every corner of my world. And that's when I realized I had to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because there was no other way to get rid of it. I had to confront whatever Hawthorne had unleashed. I had to end it, or it would never leave me alone. When I arrived at the house, for the last time, it felt different. The air was heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to return. The sky was gray and overcast, casting the old Victorian in a somber, lifeless light. I had a feeling this would be the last time I would walk through those doors. I stepped inside, every creak of the floorboards under my feet sending a jolt of tension through my body. I didn't hesitate this time. I went straight for the basement. The door was still ajar, just as I had left it, and the smell of damp earth and decay rose up to meet me as I descended the stairs. My flashlight flickered as I moved, but I didn't let myself stop. This was the moment I had been dreading, but I knew I had to see it through. The small door to the underground room was still there, waiting. I pulled it open and crawled back through the narrow passage, every inch of my body tensing as I inched forward, expecting that presence to wrap itself around me again at any moment. I reached the room, standing in the center once more, the altar looming before me like a gravestone. The objects on it seemed more grotesque now. Those locks of hair, the torn photograph of Clara and Hawthorne, the dried bloodstains on the stone. I couldn't deny it any longer. This room had seen terrible things, rituals that had opened a door to something that should never have been let in. I pulled out the book I had found during my last visit, flipping through the brittle pages once more, searching for any clue I had missed. Then I saw it, scrawled in Hawthorne's handwriting near the end of the book, something I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't part of his journal entries. It was a warning. The door was opened in blood. It must be closed in the same way. I stared at the words, trying to understand what he had meant. Hawthorne hadn't just accidentally invited something into his life. He had performed a ritual, whether he had meant to or not. And whatever he had brought into this world had taken Clara, had taken Margaret, and was still here, waiting for more. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing, the entity, the presence, it needed something. It had been feeding off the lives Hawthorne had been connected to, taking those who were closest to him. But now, it was after me. I felt my pulse quicken as the room seemed to grow darker, the air colder. I knew what I had to do. If Hawthorne had opened the door, then I had to be the one to close it. But the words in the journal rang in my mind. The door was opened in blood. It must be closed in the same way. I had no idea what Hawthorne had done to open this door, but it had cost him everything. I wasn't sure I was ready to pay the same price. But the more I stood there, the more I could feel the thing in the room with me, closing in. Its presence was oppressive, suffocating, filling the air with a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Could I walk away from this? Could I leave the house and pretend I had never found the tape, never learned the truth about Hawthorne's life? The answer, deep down, was no. I was already too far gone. The presence would follow me, just as it had followed him. It had taken Clara and Margaret, and now it would take me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the knife I had brought with me, just in case. My hand shook as I held it over my palm, knowing what I had to do, but not wanting to believe it. Blood. That's what the ritual had called for. That's how Hawthorne had opened the door, and that's how I would close it. I took a deep breath and pressed the blade into my skin, wincing as the pain shot through me. Blood welled up, dripping onto the altar, staining the stone red once again. The moment the blood touched the altar, the room seemed to shift, the air growing even colder, the darkness closing in tighter. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if anything could stop what had been unleashed. But as the blood flowed, I felt something. A shift in the atmosphere. A tremor that ran through the room. The presence was still there, but it was pulling back, as if I had thrown water on a fire, dampening its flames. The ground beneath me shook, and the walls of the room groaned as though the house itself was trying to expel whatever evil had been brought into it. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding hand, watching in awe as the altar seemed to crack and crumble, the blood running into the fissures like it was being absorbed. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The room was silent. The oppressive weight of the presence was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. I stood there for a moment, stunned, not quite believing what had just happened. The door had been closed. At least, that's what I told myself. I climbed back through the passage, out of the basement, and into the cold light of day. As I stood in front of the house, my hand still bleeding, I felt a strange sense of peace. The nightmares had stopped. The oppressive fear that had followed me for days had lifted. But as I write this, I can't help but wonder, what if it comes back? What if someone else finds the house, the tape, the room beneath the basement? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. But one thing is clear, the past never stays buried, and some doors should never be opened.